on YouTube and Facebook. And welcome, everyone. We are going to get the show started here with Elliot Ackerman. Thank you all for being here.
Hi, Terry. Hey, good evening. Welcome, everybody, to the Veterans Breakfast Club. I am Todd DiPastino. I'm the director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, and I've spent the last 17 years of my life talking with veterans, coaxing them into sharing their stories, and that's what we do tonight. That's what we're here to do tonight. And boy, do we have heavy hitters with us. We have Glenn Flickinger. We have Sean Hall.
Boy.
We have Daria Summers, who brought us a wonderful guest who's kind of out of our league, Elliot Ackerman. And I'm going to throw it to Daria because Daria is really is more familiar with Elliot's work than I am, and I should be more familiar. Elliot Ackerman, I'm going to embarrass him a little bit. I know him by reputation only, I must say, and the articles that he's written that have been in, major national publications. I've not read his novels and I've not read his memoirs, and I'm sorry about that. They're on my list. Elliot Ackerman is considered one of the finest writers of his generation, and certainly one of the most versatile writers of his generation. And he's a veteran. He's a Marine Corps veteran. He was a Marine infantry special operations officer for 8 years, and a CIA operative or officer, and then he got into writing. And man, is he prolific! Again, I'll embarrass him a little bit, but I think he's written more books in the past 10 years than I've read. He's published, I think, 10 books in the past 10 years, something like that. Half a dozen or more novels, a couple of memoirs, a lot of articles and essays and short stories. So he's a Silver Star recipient, Purple Heart recipient, 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. So whenever he writes about war, he certainly knows what he's writing about. And we're going to get to Elliot very soon. But I want to make a few announcements. First of all, we have 2 Hall of Famers with us here. First Hall, I guess we'll go by age, meaning the elder. Brad Washabaugh, you are a Marine Corps Marathon Hall of Famer.
That's true. As of Friday, and quite an honor, and I really humbled by it. And ran the Marine Corps Marathon, the 50th Marine Corps Marathon yesterday. And, I ran the first one in 1976, so I was able to go back 50 years after the first and make it through 26.2 miles. So it was quite an event. It was close to 40,000 runners around Washington, the 3rd largest marathon in the United States. It's known as a People's Marathon. It attracts a lot of first-time runners, but people who run with a purpose, to remember a service member, to give thanks, to overcome. There's many different reasons, but you see plenty of emotion out there on the course. You just can't beat it for that.
Yeah, it's not just a marathon, in other words. It's something more than that. It's much more than that.
And anytime you talk to a marathoner within an arm's reach, they always have their finisher medal here, And this medal signifies really since we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Marine Corps. It's old school here from the 1800s, and it signifies the history of the Marine Corps. And you open it up, and there's a 1976 finisher patch.
Oh,
that is there. I donated mine to the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico along with my original shirt and whatnot. So it was really a memorable event, and so proud to be able to do it, and also humbled at the same time. Thank you.
What number marathon was this for you?
It's number 40 and
40.
Number 22 for the Marine Corps Marathon. I've been able to do the last 16 consecutive marathons, and I tip my hat to people like Jerry down there, who's also quite an accomplished athlete, and to everybody that tries and works so hard to overcome, to put the effort in to do something that seems impossible, but they go out and take that first step and put one after the other to get where they want to be.
How are you feeling today, Colonel?
Well, I'm not ready to run yet. I'm not. I walk like I fell off a horse, but give me a few days and I will be able to walk a straight line without wincing.
Well, Brad, you are going to be here in Pittsburgh from North Carolina next weekend. We'll be able to see you in
Right,
person. You'll
right.
be coming to our breakfast that's in Greensburg, PA, and we have a board meeting. So I look forward to seeing you and talking to you further about it. I also want to congratulate Terry Swank, our very own Terry, another Hall of Famer who was just inducted into the Ohio Veterans Hall of Fame. Terry, you spent 36 years in the Army,
The Army National Guard, yes.
Army National Guard, and your career really bridged quite a span. I mean, I'm not saying you're old,
36
Terry,
years.
but I'm saying it bridged quite a span of history, you know? You got into the Army like just after the WACs were disbanded,
Yes. Yes, I did.
and you ended up retiring when?
2015.
Okay. And you are going to be inducted. Is there a ceremony?
Next Thursday on the 6th of November.
Will we be able to watch it?
Actually, you can on the Ohio channel.
Oh, we all get the Ohio channel.
It's an online thing.
Okay. All right. Well, please send us the link,
Yeah, I'll
Terry.
send you info.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And we were able to follow Brad on his race, by the way, on his.
Really?
Yeah. 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 Yes, we had and we were kind of cheering him, saying, "Come on, Brad. Come on, Brad."
Did he hear you?
It's like watching paint dry sometimes, Todd, you know?
Yeah, it was a little boring, I have to
Yeah,
say.
I know.
Yeah.
Um,
That's an impressive medal, though.
yeah,
Yeah.
I know. That would slow me down. Um, Not that I would ever run a marathon, but I also want to let people know we have this program coming up with this interesting guy whose name you might recognize, Paul Tibbets the Fourth. Glenn, you want to tell us about our program Thursday night?
Yeah, Paul Tibbets, the fourth Air Force Academy grad, 1989, if I'm not mistaken. He is the grandson of the more well-known Paul Tibbets, who was the man who piloted the Enola Gay and dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. What's interesting is Paul's going to, start this discussion with his grandfather's history. And if I've made this point many times on our Air Force, 8th Air Force programs, Paul Tibbets in August 17th of 42 led the first B-17 raid from England to France. I think it was 12 B-17 bombers. He was considered the best pilot in the Air Force at that time. After completing missions there, he went on to the B-29 and, of course, into history as the man who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. Paul Tibbets the fourth, basically a Cold War fighter. He becomes the commander of the same outfit that his grandfather commanded, and a B-2 bomber pilot. So it kind of takes us from B-17s and the original atomic bomb to B-2s and nuclear deterrence today. So he's a fascinating speaker.
So it'll be a program really on American air power over the past 80 years or so.
That's just well put. Yeah.
And then we will be back here on Monday night. We'll have open conversation, which we like to have once a month. Please bring the topics. I know that we have several people have already sent me things that they'd like to discuss. Please do, if you want to add to the agenda for Monday night, just email me, todd@veteransbreakfastclub.org, or you could email sean@veteransbreakfastclub.org, and we'll make sure we get you on the agenda. Should be an interesting conversation. It always is. We have our big annual Veterans Breakfast here in Pittsburgh. It's usually between 400 and 500 people at the Rivers Casino here in Pittsburgh. We're going to have, as we always like to do, have many people speaking and sharing stories. One story we're really going to highlight is Lori Pearl's story of serving in Vietnam. She was one of 627 Donut Dollies, Red Cross volunteers. Here she is with fantastic sunglasses. She still has sunglasses just like it. And we had a great time traveling with her to Vietnam several years ago. So she's going to come and share her story. And then we'll be covering a lot of other stories too. And then just 3 days later, we'll be in Valley Forge, PA at the Sheraton Valley Forge King of Prussia. And our special guest speaking will be the director of the Philadelphia VA Healthcare. and that's Admiral Karen Flaherty Oxler. She will be speaking then. Big announcement. Finally today, Glenn and I got the final details set for a trip that we've been planning for a long time. This is our World War II Italian campaign tour. We're going to do it over 14 days, Sicily to Rome, and it's going to be next October, October 17th through 30th. This is the route that we will be taking. We're going to spend a good bit of time in Sicily itself. That was a big debate. How much time to spend in Sicily? Should we go north of Rome? And we decided to focus this tour on Sicily and then on the campaign in southern Italy, the landing at Salerno, the infamous battles at Cassino, Venafro, Rapido River, Anzio landing, and then we'll fly out of Rome. And I've got to say, Glenn, you were so great and so patient in working with me to get this itinerary together.
Well, it was really a work of joy and love to put this together. Coming with us and actually featuring another historian is David DeAndrea, who teaches at University of Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State, he teaches Western civilization, Italian Renaissance, Reformation, etc. He was a Fulbright scholar, and he's a great guy, and he speaks Italian, and he's been to Italy umpteen times on similar trips because he is the advisor to the 45th Infantry Division National Guard. And the 45th Infantry Division was the famous National Guard division. It landed in Sicily, fought all those battles in Italy, was withdrawn after Anzio, and then fought its way through southern France to Dachau and Munich. I think it's the division with the most days of combat in World War II, if I recall that right.
I think the 34th had them beat, but I'm not sure.
Okay, we'll look that up. We'll bet lunch on that, Todd.
Okay.
So having David along is a real bonus. And of course, there's another famous historian coming along by the name of Todd DePastina, who is the leading expert in the country on one Bill Maudlin.
That's right.
The famous cartoonist with the 45th Division. So I'm going to be very pleased to come on this as just the add-on. I'll carry their bags for the 2 weeks, and we're really looking forward to it. The information's on the website now. We're going to begin bombarding you with emails and announcements. We'd like to get 34 people to come, so please consider coming.
Yeah, I could share the webpage for it, and we'll be sending out reminders about it. And I'm thrilled to be going, especially, I wrote the book on Bill Mauldin, but never retraced his footsteps in Sicily and southern Italy. So I'll be excited to do that for the first time. So thank you. And thank you all for your patience. Thank you, Elliot, for your patience as we go through these announcements. I want to throw it now to Daria. Daria, thank you so much for bringing us such a highbrow guest tonight. I really appreciate you making contact with Elliot and coaxing him to join us tonight for this conversation.
Well, thank you, Todd, and welcome, Elliot. And for anyone who has, because people may have come after you gave your original introduction, Todd, I'll just say a few things about Elliot, and hopefully he'll be able to fill in the rest. So Elliot joined the Marine Corps in 2003, served for 8 years, first as an infantry officer and later as a special operations officer. And over the course of his career, he served 5 tours of duty between Iraq and Afghanistan. In the fall of 2004, he led a Marine rifle platoon during the Second Battle of Fallujah. His heroism during that time got him a Silver Star and a Purple Heart. And in 2008, in Afghanistan, he was awarded a Bronze Star for leading his men through an ambush. Elliot left the Marines in 2009, and after a brief stint in the CIA, quickly became one of the country's most distinguished writers of novels and memoirs, with over 9 books to his name, which include The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan. He is also, and this I think is very important, a design council co-chair for the Global War on Terror Memorial, which is going to be built fairly soon, I hope. His debut novel, Green on Blue, is the story of a young Afghan boy who joins a US-funded militia in order to save his injured brother. And his latest book, which is the reason we got him here, is called Sheepdogs. It's just out. It's a dark comedy and sort of high-stakes thriller about two veterans, one who served as a CIA operative and the other who served as a pilot in the US or in the Afghan Air Force. It's funny and it's dark, and I couldn't put it down. So, Elliot, welcome.
Oh, thanks so much, Daria and Todd, both of you for your introduction. And Todd, as I told you in the waiting room, anyone who would call me highbrow hasn't gotten to sheepdogs yet because it's a comedy, and I think it goes pretty lowbrow with some of the humor.
Yeah, but it's fun,
Thanks.
which is the main thing. So I just wanted to start off, and we can get to sheepdogs, but I know a lot of people will be curious about your background and your sort of journey because you know, at 20, as I've read about you, it's not like you woke up and said, I want to be a writer. You woke up and said, I want to join the Marines. So you had this journey, and I was wondering, but I did notice that you don't come from a military family. So tell us how you ended up in the Marines.
Sure. So I was actually a very improbable Marine. So if you knew me when I was a teenager, I had really long hair. I was very into skateboarding, and I wore baggy pants. And there were a lot of people in my family who were concerned. And never played a varsity sport till my senior year of high school. And then when I was about 18, I kind of had this epiphany that it was sort of time to grow up a little bit. I had always had this sort of secret interest in the military, like seeing your promo for your trip to Sicily and Italy. I mean, that sounds amazing. Definitely the type of thing I would be into doing. But that combination of interests. Also, I grew up abroad in the UK for 6 years. So traveling abroad, I think, gave me an appreciation of what it meant to be an American. Led me to wanting to serve. And this was pre 9/11. I got involved in the ROTC in my college, and then 9/11 happened while I was in college. So everything sort of went from my expectations of what my service would be in the Marine Corps, were sort of before 9/11 that, I might, if I was lucky, deploy somewhere. And who knows if I was really lucky, get the chance to, participate in a humanitarian aid mission or maybe even evacuate an embassy. But then everything switched with 9/11, and I went from joining a peacetime Marine Corps to joining a wartime Marine Corps. And as you mentioned, I graduated 2003, which was sort of a very interesting and kinetic year to be a newly minted infantry officer in the Marines.
Absolutely. I mean, that must have been amazing to be in that position right while 9/11 happened. I mean, it's sort of like the whole world changed.
Yeah, Dara, I'll often, speak with sort of younger Marines and talk about that time. And one of the things I always, really hold on to was um, how oftentimes your expectations of what you are entering, as a Marine, as a soldier, as a serviceman, can radically depart and become much more kinetic. So, for instance, I showed up in Quantico, Virginia, in June of 2003. And sort of the atmosphere in June of 2003, right after the invasion of Iraq, which, as we know, went very well initially, was amongst the captains who were there and us young lieutenants as well. Lieutenants, you all missed the war. We missed it too. I guess we sort of have to get down to the business of soldiering. So that was sort of the atmosphere all through that summer. And then I remember about, August, September, these first lieutenants, soon to be captains, showed up as instructors, and they were some of the ones who'd been in the invasion. So they sort of came back to Quantico with their war stories. And then that December of 2003, there was a front page of the Marine Corps Times, which we used to, get the physical copies of and all read very diligently. And it said Marines back to Iraq. And all of a sudden, why are we going back to Iraq? I mean, the only thing going on in Iraq is occupation duty, and the Army typically does this type of occupation duty. Marines don't do this. So there was sort of a big question mark. And that was the case all that winter. And then in March of 2004, I was at the infantry officer course. And that was when the first battles of Ramadi and Fallujah happened. And then there was this real awareness that there was a violent insurgency that was going. I mean, there had sort of been inklings of it in the months, but that was when we sort of knew. Those of us we were graduating that April, we knew that we were going to war.
So then you graduated in April, where that was the first Fallujah battle and Ramadi. I mean, that was erupting. And then you got there sort of in the summer in time for the Second Battle of Fallujah.
So that's right. So my infantry battalion, I was with the 1st Battalion of the 8th Marine Regiment, and we arrived in Iraq in June of 2004, which was the same month that the coalition provisional government was stood down, and the Iraqis were sort of given charge again of the country. And so we sort of spent that whole summer doing counterinsurgency work, dodging IEDs, getting ambushed, and everybody knew that all the enemy activity, everything bad going on in Al Anbar province, which is where they had sent all the Marines, and which is where we all were, everyone knew it was coming out of Fallujah. But the problem was, after the first Fallujah battle, the sort of the truce that occurred, part of that truce was that Americans wouldn't be allowed into Fallujah and the Iraqi government would control Fallujah. But what very quickly happened is the Fallujah Brigade, which was sort of the group of Iraqi soldiers and police that were given charge of Fallujah, they just were completely ineffective. And Fallujah became this really nasty sanctuary for Al Qaeda in Iraq, but it was a no-go zone for the Iraqi army and for Americans. And it became very clear that summer that at some point we were going to have to deal with Fallujah, and there would be a pitched battle there. And it was one of those things where it was a big question mark, but even the most junior PFC knew this was coming. Like, I remember having conversations with like the most junior Marines in my platoon that summer, and they'd be like, hey, sir, so like, listen, everybody knows we got to go into Fallujah, and we're rotating back to the States in February. So they want to do it before, the whole division switches out in February, and the presidential election is like in November. So they probably don't want to do it right before the presidential election. So the way I see it is like, we're going into Fallujah like end of November, early December. Like, what do you think, sir? I'm like, yeah, I think you got it about right. And that's exactly what happened. I think it was George Bush won the presidential election on a Tuesday, and I think we got our orders the next Wednesday to go into Fallujah. And the battle was November of 2004.
Because there was nothing, it was just, we want to go in there. There was nothing immediate in the sense. It was just somebody had to give the okay.
Yes, I mean, listen, someone had to give the okay, and at the worst, and the risk of stating the very obvious, war is politics.
Yeah.
So whether or not President Bush won or didn't win, we would have fought that battle either way. But no one wanted to fight the battle right before the presidential election, because the lesson that had come out in that spring, the spring battle, which was fought to a stalemate, was it's very, very messy to fight that type of an urban battle.
Yeah.
And immediately once the battle started, there were civilians in the city, civilian casualties, claims of civilian casualties, and the Marines were stopped from actually taking the city, and the pause button was pushed. So I think everyone knew that the second battle, had the potential to become very politically messy. But unlike the first battle, the second was telegraphed so far ahead of time with pamphlets and warnings. And so the city was evacuated. So for weeks before that battle, civilians were just pouring out of the city. And so by the time we went in, there were virtually no civilians that we saw in the entire city. The only people there were there to fight.
So that would have been a big difference between what happened in the spring in Ramadi and Fallujah.
Absolutely.
It was very messy.
Very, very messy. And when we went in, it was at least from that perspective less complex.
Yeah. Did you so how long did you fight that? How long did it go on for?
So that battle lasted about a month.
Wow.
And people have sometimes asked me, what was the battle like? And actually, the best answer that I have is, if any of you have seen Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket,
Oh yeah.
the second half of Full Metal Jacket, when the Marines are fighting in Waste City. And I hope this doesn't sound glib, but truly, I have no better. That is very much what being in that battle felt like. Just sort of the grit of the kind of day after day of that type of urban combat. But so it was about a month for our battalion, and then they pulled us off the line.
So, I just when you say they pulled you off the line, well, what does that mean? Like, what did you win?
So
What did we get?
so yeah,
Was the mission accomplished?
so the when the battle started, it was the entire First Marine Division, which was 6 infantry battalions. And of those 6 infantry battalions, people forget 2 were Army battalions that were fighting under the First Marine Division, and we went almost online through the city. And there was, again, a lot of pressure for the Marines not to get bogged down in Fallujah. So we made it through the city, the main assault, in a week. And as we were fighting through the city, um, and again, I mean, this is sort of like the wisdom of the PFC and the Lance Corporal. We knew that we were sort of bypassing pockets of enemy resistance as we were making this advance. And so, the PFCs and Lance Corporals in my platoon would often be like, hey, sir, like, what's going to happen? What are we going to do when we get to the end of the city? Because, we know, there are a lot of bad guys behind us now, too. We didn't get everybody back there. And I was like, I don't know exactly what we're going to do when we get to the end of the city. What I didn't want to say, which is what wound up happening, is that we were just going to turn around and go back. So we got to the south end of the city. Our platoon in particular, we were pretty chewed up by the time we got to the south end of the city. We had about more than half of my platoon had been medically evacuated at that point. And it was a really awe-inspiring thing. I mean, as a Marine, everything I'd ever heard about the Marine Corps, learned about in my training, about young Marines stepping up into leadership positions. It was a real privilege to see that happen in just spectacular fashion, to see like the 20-year-old senior Lance Corporal whose fire team leader was wounded step in and become the fire team leader, or the 22-year-old corporal whose squad leader is wounded become the new squad leader. And that happened in my platoon. 2 out of my 3 squad leaders were medically evacuated, and 4 out of the 6 team leaders were. So you saw Marines kind of stepping up all that time. But then when we got to the end of the city, we were all given satellite maps of Fallujah, gridded out and then subgridded out, with basically every single building had a grid reference. And we would just go for the rest of that month. We went house to house to house to house, checking each building off one at a time. And people have sometimes asked me, specific to that battle, what's the bravest thing you saw anybody do? So I had the privilege to see, I mean, a lot of real heroism. I mean, Marines running out in the street to get their buddies. I mean, guys with a SMAW, which is like our bazooka, sprinting into a machine gun swept street to take out an enemy position. I had the privilege to see all of that. The most courageous thing I think I ever saw was, for that month, day after day, again, these like young Lance Corporals, the first guy in the stack, just going through the city, kicking in the front door of building after building, not knowing what was behind the door, just playing this massive game of Russian roulette. And those young Marines standing up under that psychological strain was really, really impressive to see.
Wow.
Daria,
Yeah, I want to open it up for questions.
no,
Oh.
I want to open it up for my question.
Okay.
And that is, could you, Elliot, I'm just was afraid Daria was not going to ask this. Could you tell us why you received a Silver Star at the Second Battle of Fallujah?
Sure. And I will say this with the caveat, one of the things about those types of awards is those types of awards only get handed out when everything kind of goes a little bit sideways. So I was for a series of actions on the third day of the battle. And long story short, our platoon, our company's initial charge in the Fallujah assault was, there was a complex of buildings called the Government Center, which was the government center for Iraq. And that was a battalion objective. And so the first day of the battle, two companies of our battalion sort of fought about 500 meters into the city. And then on the morning of the second day, very early at about 3 in the morning, our company launched a mechanized raid, sort of up. They opened a corridor. So we sort of went through this corridor they'd opened up, and then we punched about 700 meters deeper into the city, kind of way ahead of the battalion, grabbed this government center. And then our mission was sort of Alamo style to hold on to it while everybody else fought up to us. So we did that on the first day of the battle. Everyone fought up to us. And then my platoon, we found ourselves sort of as the southernmost platoon for the battalion, and our battalion was the southernmost battalion in the regiment. And we were about a third of the way into the city at that point. And so I'm just sort of setting the stage for you. And there was there's an east-west highway called Highway 10 that runs through Fallujah. It's a wide sort of 6-lane, really the only main road. And on our maps, we called it Phase Line Fran. So if you ask any Fallujah veterans, like, hey, where were you when you crossed Phase Line Fran? Like, everybody's got their story of crossing Phase Line Fran. Sort of, I guess, the modern equivalent of like going over the top in World War I. So because our platoon was the furthest south, that next day, the entire battalion was going to cross Phase Line Fran. But one of the things you learn in urban warfare is the first step is you do this and you want to get a foothold. So our platoon was tasked with sort of getting the battalion foothold. So we snuck across Phase Line Fran in the middle of the night. And before we snuck across Phase Line Fran, we picked a building that looked like it'd be a really good, sort of good angles of fire. We could support the battalion once we snuck into this building. But they said, hey, before you go, we have an AC-130 gunship, and we're going to shoot into that building. So to kind of prep fires, take care of anyone who might be waiting for you in the building. So the AC-130 gunship does that for us. You can imagine we sneak into the building. We're all on our night vision goggles. I get through the front door, and I was moving right behind our first squad. And there's just dust and debris and chaos. And it turns out the gunship had collapsed the back half of the building. So we couldn't fight from this building. So, being a good Marine, right, you've got two options. You can go back to the company and tell your company commander, hey, I failed the mission. We got to rethink this. Or you can find another building. So we looked a little bit deeper into the city and found this building that was deeper into the city that looked like it would serve those purposes. We moved into that building, and it turned out it was actually like kind of like a 7-Eleven. So we called it the candy store. And by this point too, we're kind of, you can imagine we're a bunch of like tired out Marines. We've worked through a lot of our MREs, and the young Marines get in this candy store, and it's filled with like soda and Pringles chips. And so, they're all excited to get a little snack. And then we set up our fields of fire in this candy store. And the next morning, the sun kind of comes up, and none of the insurgents thought we were that deep into the city. So we could see them sort of just moving into their fighting positions, kind of just diddy bopping down the street. And we open fire. And then over the course of that day, we're just in a running gunfight. But I'm sorry, it's sort of a long way of saying our platoon gets surrounded in this building. We thought we would be sort of moving across Phase Line Fran first thing the next morning. It gets late into that afternoon. We're still surrounded. The battalion is still fighting at the government center. And when we finally break out of that building, our platoon then had to go about 500 meters deeper into the city. We got, chewed up, pretty good going deeper into the city. And to answer your question specifically, there were a couple of moments where we had to mark targets for tanks. And one of the only ways that tanks could see the markings for, shoot here, shoot there, would be with a tracer round. But the tracer round on a 5.56, M16 is too light for a tank to see. They can only see the heavier 7.62 tracer rounds from our medium machine guns. So I wound up occupying a position on one rooftop with a machine gun marking rounds for tanks for a long time.
And you were wounded in the candy store, were you not?
I was wounded 2 days later.
Okay, 2 days later.
2 days later, yeah.
And what was the nature of your wound?
We were clearing out a series. We were clearing out a series of buildings, and as we were trying to clear them out, we thought they were clear, and I had another Marine who'd been wounded as we were clearing out. He was actually my first platoon sergeant had been shot in the head through his helmet, and he was my replacement platoon sergeant. I only bring that up because it gave me a bad reputation. Nobody wanted me to be my platoon sergeant because both my platoon sergeants got hurt. But this guy, his name was Ricardo Sebastian. Everybody called him Seabass. Just a real, gritty, hard fighting Marine staff sergeant, and he had been leading groups of Marines to clear these buildings out. And in the third building he was in, he got shot through the leg and through the arm, and a couple other Marines were hurt as well. And so we brought in an Amtrak, which is like an armored personnel carrier, to evacuate them. And you should imagine a lot of chaos. We're loading people, and I was helping trying to load them into the back of the Amtrak. The Amtrak has its troop compartment open, and as they were loading into the back, we thought we had this building cleared. And I'll never forget it. I see this silhouette appear on the rooftop of the building, and it was an insurgent we missed. And he takes a grenade and he throws the grenade down. And it was like watching like the longest free throw you'll ever watch in your life, because he's aiming the grenade into the open troop compartment hatch. And if he makes it, he would have killed all the Marines in the back. Fortunately, he didn't make it. It bounced off, landed between the Amtrak and the wall of the house, but that was exactly where I happened to be standing. So I just caught some frag in the back, and was fine. Returned to duty. There a lot of people got much worse. So I was pretty lucky.
Thank you, Elliot.
Wow.
Wow.
So I was very interested in the fact that you had served 5 tours. How many tours, how did that split up between Afghanistan and Iraq?
The rest of my combat tours were in Afghanistan. In that list, I also, one of the things that was sort of surreal was we came back from that Iraq deployment in February of 2005. And our next real posting was we were sent to Hurricane Katrina to do relief work in New Orleans for more than a month. So this sort of same group of Marines, and this is, again, I mean, not to be too parochial, but this is one of the things that the Marine Corps does so well. That same group of young men who just been, fighting it out block to block in Fallujah were within 9 months of coming home, sitting in post-hurricane New Orleans, handing out bottles of water and helping people, clear out their houses and try to get back into their houses. So we came back, we did that. We then deployed with a Marine Expeditionary Unit to the Mediterranean the next summer in 2006, and Israel invaded Lebanon. And I finally got my embassy evacuation. So we participated in evacuating all of the Americans out of Beirut, which is sort of very classic Marine deployment. And then I went to Marine Special Operations, which are now the Raiders, in the very early days of that unit as it was standing up, and led a Marine Special Operations team in Western Afghanistan. And we were partnered with a battalion of about 700 Afghan commandos, think kind of like their equivalent of the Rangers. And our mission was capture kill operations against senior Taliban leadership in Western Afghanistan. And so that was about an 8-month deployment in 2008.
So when did that, there's the story of you got a third medal because you led your men out of basically what was an ambush. Is that?
Sure, yeah. So that was in Afghanistan in 2008. And again, these things, they sort of hand them out when everything goes a little pear-shaped. So our team and a company of Afghan battalions, a company of Afghan commandos, we were called in as the quick reaction force for one of our sister teams. And so they had been fighting, they'd been ambushed outside of a town called Shawan in Western Afghanistan. And they'd been fighting all the day before. And one of the things that was interesting about being in Afghanistan at that time, if you worked in special operations, was there was a SAT channel called SAT 102. So SAT 102 was the nationwide satellite channel for the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force. So you would have inside of your team all of your internal communications where you would talk to each other, but you would call out missions on SAT 102. So if you're back at your base, and you had Sat 102 on the speaker box, you could hear what was going on across the country. So like there are actually some like very big battles that happened in Afghanistan at that time, like the Battle for Wanat, which a movie was made about, where a couple of soldiers received the Medal of Honor. I remember listening to that on Sat 102. And at this time, my buddy's team was getting ambushed, and we were hearing what was going on Sat 102. So we were all sitting there all that day, kind of ready to go as the quick reaction force if they called us. They called us in the afternoon, and we drove all through the night down to link up with them because they thought they were going to have to sort of fight through this town in the morning. So, as is often the case, we link up with them at night. We're ready to push through the town in the morning. We push into the town, but all the Taliban had cleared out in the night. So we sort of spend the better part of that day clearing out the town, finding weapons caches and whatever they left behind. The afternoon wears on. We have a couple detainees with us. We say, all right, mission's over. We're going to return back to base. There's sort of only one way in and out of this area, and went through a town called Shawan. And as we were going back through Shawan, our team was ambushed, and we lost a soldier, Sergeant First Class Dave Nunez, in that ambush, and we had to sort of go back and kind of fight back through the ambush to try to get his body out and get all of the Marines and Special Forces soldiers and Afghans kind of out of that ambush and back up to base. So that's what that was for.
Wow. So that was 2008. Was that so? Because you were a Marine, so your deployments were how long exactly?
Depended. This one was about 8 months, but there would be 7 months, 8 months typically. And then the rest the rest of those deployments were times that I was at the agency.
Oh, okay. And of course, I want to note in that battle, that's where you got your Bronze Star.
Yes.
You were awarded the Bronze Star. Okay. Was that for the specific action of getting your people out of the ambush?
Yes. Yeah, it was I think it was for that day. And I think I'd have to reread the citation. I think it might have also been for a series of raids a little later in a valley called the Zirko Valley.
So I'm interested, just because you were sort of deep in combat points in both Iraq and Afghanistan. When you look back on it now, how different, like, how interchangeable was it? How different did it feel? I mean, obviously Fallujah was an empty city, mostly empty of civilians, and the landscape in Afghanistan is completely different. But just in terms of like, what were you fighting for? Why were you there? How hard was the mission? And many years, like 5 years later, you're in Afghanistan. I'm just wondering if perception wise, how did it feel different?
Sure. Well, I mean, listen, I think one thing that I'll say, and maybe this group will understand it better than most, but the politics always seemed really immaterial in terms of how we were thinking, why are we there? I mean, if you had gone to any of the Marines in that house I mentioned, the candy store on, that was November 11th, 2004, said, hey man, why are you here? You wouldn't have heard a paragraph about to create a free, stable, and democratic Iraq. I mean, they probably would have said, I'm here because I always wanted to be a Marine. I'm here for it's a cliche, but for these guys, my brothers. And that's probably about it. That this is what they wanted to do, desperate, be Marines, and there's a real, I was in a great platoon. These guys loved each other. So that was what everyone was fighting for. In terms of how it felt, and by the way, that was the exact same in Afghanistan when I was with the Raiders, and in every unit I ever served in terms of the politics, and particularly so in Afghanistan. By the time I arrived in Afghanistan, it was 2008. So it's ironic now because the war had been going on for 7 years, and but if you say to someone now you're in Afghanistan in 2008, it's sort of like saying you were in Vietnam in 1965. It actually was considered now early days of that war. And ironically, too, I think, I was in Iraq 0405, Afghanistan 08 to 2011. And every war I've ever shown up to, also as a journalist, I've always felt like I've arrived late when in fact I look back and I was there sort of early.
Right.
But to answer your question, sorry to go on a tangent there. The difference between Iraq and Afghanistan, I felt politically that you could feel was the way they fought. So the Iraqi and the members of Al Qaeda and Iraqi, so it's much more ideological. You're really fighting hardcore jihadists. So you would see things. I saw things in Fallujah, for instance, where insurgents would run out in the street and spray an Abrams tank with an AK-47. I mean, that is like the stupidest tactic ever, and the tank makes very short work of that person without getting too grim and macabre about it.
Mhm.
You would never see someone do that in Afghanistan. The Afghans and the Taliban were very savvy. If you got ambushed, you'd be ambushed for about 30, 45 minutes tops, because they knew that was how long it would take us to get air on station, and they would vanish. So
Oh,
you were up against sort of a much more formidable adversary. You could also have this sense too, I think, a little bit in Iraq, that politically speaking, there was, there'd been the war. It started in 2003. But before that, I mean, it'd been Saddam Hussein's Iraq, not a great place to be, but there'd been this sort of nominal peace, and that war was kind of an aberration, that it wasn't the norm. Well, by the time I was fighting in Afghanistan, the average age of an Afghan man is a little over 60 years old. So when I was there, the war that started in 1979 had been going on for more than, I mean, almost 30 years at that point. So most Afghans you met, I mean, they had no adult memory of their country being at peace. So when you talk to them about like, hey, we're going to fight this war, we're going to build this road, we're going to defeat the insurgents, and then there'll be peace. Peace wasn't like the return to some status, some state that existed before the invasion. Peace was like, it was a complete work of imagination for them to imagine, like, what's this peace you
wow.
speak about?
Yeah.
And that, I think, made at times the work we were doing, very, very challenging, because the war was just so deeply rooted in everybody's conscience.
Well, that's so interesting. I haven't heard it put quite like that, but it makes total sense.
Yeah.
Makes total sense. I get it. Um, Todd, I just wanted to check to see if there are any questions, if people have any questions, because I was going to move on to another part two. But if
Yeah.
people
Oh,
wanted to
yeah.
ask Elliot now.
We have a number of comments. Somebody said you have a very high IQ, Elliot. I said
I'm trying.
you're
Tell
out
my
of our
wife.
and Glenn Flickinger asks, any PTSD issues for Elliot or his fellow Marines?
Sure. Well, I would say, you know, people ask me sometimes about PTSD, and I think it's important to kind of define the term first. And I've done this a little bit in some of my writings as I've thought about this. So let me kind of just take a crack at it. So there's the type of PTSD, I mean, where, you have nightmares, flashbacks, very intense and debilitating. So what I'm about to say is not to diminish that. I have not experienced that type of PTSD, nor have I seen that quite as widespread amongst my cohort. What I have seen is something different. I don't know if you want to call it PTSD, call it whatever you want, but let me kind of describe it. Um, which is that it has to do with purpose. So I think any any person, in order to be happy, all of us, we have to have a purpose. So to give like a very bland definition of purpose is, let's say there's a person, that person works a job, that job puts food on the table for their family, they watch their children grow and have more opportunities and a better life than they had. That gives them a purpose, and from that purpose, they derive their happiness. So I think when you go to war, when you're, in your late teens or early 20s, whether you're a, soldier or Marine or whatever, you kind of develop a somewhat dysfunctional relationship with purpose. And what I mean by that is, so let's say you're on like a, your platoon is charged with holding a hilltop in Afghanistan, or maybe it's a few city blocks in Iraq. You have, at least at the tactical level, a pretty clear mission, and you're charged with accomplishing that mission with a group of people that are probably going to be some of the best friends you ever have in your life. So that's like this very, very intense sense of purpose that you have at a very young age. I would even go so far as to say, if purpose is the drug that induces happiness, that you are like freebasing the crystal meth of purpose starting at age 21, 22. It's really, really intense. And you do that for a while. You can do that for, 4 years, 8 years, however long you do it. But at a certain point, it's time to come home. I mean, whether the war ends or you leave, you come home, you get home, and you have to repurpose yourself. And so let's say maybe you look around and you're going to go get a job at Home Depot or use your GI Bill to go back to college or whatever you're going to go do in your next chapter, to give yourself that sense of purpose. But it's not quite as intense as what you did before. It doesn't give you that same rush. So instead of it being like the crystal meth of purpose, it's more kind of like the Cooler's Light of purpose.
Yeah.
And you have this realization that you're going to spend the rest of your life sitting on your front porch drinking Cooler's Light, and a certain depression sets in. And I've seen that cycle play out with a lot of people that struggle to repurpose oneself and find something that can, maybe it's never going to fill you up as much as it filled you up being a squad leader or a platoon commander in Iraq or Afghanistan, but something that's going to do it for you enough that you want to get out of bed every day. And so when I look at, my colleagues, comrades of mine who the ones who've really struggled, it's been a version of that, of just not being able to find the next thing. And when I look at my own journey, my struggle coming back, and what I feel grateful was what was going to be that next thing for me. It became writing. But for me too, to become a writer and to do this was it was a struggle. You don't just wake up and decide you're going to be a writer. It can be tough to become a writer. And so that was a real journey for me as well. So in terms of the question, just PTSD, if you want to call that PTSD, that is a PTSD that I've seen has been endemic amongst my generation of veterans that struggle with purpose upon coming home.
I don't know if I've ever heard it expressed better.
I'm stunned. I've never thought of it this way.
Yeah.
In the terms you've just described.
Yeah. And I think we hear that a lot in our veterans in their stories. But it's never quite been crystallized the way you did. And I do want to get to Kim Enderly. I believe she's probably going to make a comment, a good comment, an important comment. But I also want to then say, Elliot, isn't sheepdogs, doesn't that cover a lot of that issue of kind of coming home and just not having the nobility of purpose that you once had in the Marine Corps?
Sure. I mean, Sheepdogs is fundamentally, it's a heist novel. It's a lot of fun. It's about two guys who repossess a private jet, and they're basically they come home from war and they become international repo men. But they're an American, and they're an American guy, much like me, a raider and a CIA officer and an Afghan pilot, and they're struggling to figure out what they are going to do when they come home and how to kind of remake their lives in a society that has sort of moved on. And so it's, the novel is definitely, this book is definitely comic, and it's comic for a reason. One of the things in some of my other books that never got in there was the fact that like war and the guys who fight war, it's funny because war is so serious. You can't take it seriously all the time. So, often on missions and in the most sort of desperate situations, guys would be cutting jokes just to get through the tension and off gas a little bit. But it's tragic, a little tragic. And the tragedy is that it's sort of, the struggle that these two characters in the book are having with figuring out how to exist in this society that's moved on from them.
Kim, could you please interject your thought here?
Well, so I'm a combat veteran myself, and I get of multiple different deployments. And so I guess my thought is I often wonder when we're in these forums and people ask people just directly in front of everybody if they have PTSD.
Yeah.
I think that's if it was me and I was speaking and I got asked that, I would somehow defer that question because I don't know, I find that's very personal.
Yeah.
I mean, asking someone how they deal with or have they seen people deal with it is a different question than asking someone personally if they have PTSD. But I had a different question I wanted to ask you, Elliot. I have some friends that were Marines, and I guess I'd ask you to take a different perspective and tell me what you think about the U.S. destruction of Fallujah. Now, as you look back at it all these years later, what you think of the battle there and the people that lived there and what the U.S. mission was in that particular city. Do you have a different take on that now? I mean, have you looked at the other side to see, what the U.S. cost of war was to the people there? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think, war is obviously horrible. I think when it comes to, the city of Fallujah, I'll start specific and I'll branch out. When we went into Fallujah, Al-Qaeda had completely taken over that city. So Waiting for us inside were a couple thousand members of Al-Qaeda in Iraq from all different nationalities. And over the course of fighting in Fallujah, as we were clearing out the city, I personally walked into rooms and basements of rooms where they had made, beheading videos. You could see the car battery in the corner where they were torturing people. There was nothing. There were not a lot of good things going on in Fallujah in the fall of 2004. And then when the fighting started, it was the equivalent of the island hopping campaign in World War II. You'd come up to a building, there'd be 3 or 4 guys in that building, and they would wait for the Marines to get as close as they could before they would open up. And when and our tactics really evolved over the course of that battle. So initially, the Marines were going into these houses and we were sort of clearing them out, almost like Delta Force, Navy SEAL style, CQB, close quarter battle tactics, send Marines into rooms to clear them. You have to clear them. And very early on, we stopped doing that. Because what you realize is if you had 2 or 3 guys waiting in a house to kill you, a lot of Marines were going to get killed doing that. So what we would do was we would basically, as we were moving through the city, if we came up to a building and someone started shooting us from that building, we would back off. We would surround the building and we would drop the building. And we would typically just drop the building we had armored bulldozers, these D9 bulldozers, or if we had an Abrams battle tank, we would just use a tank to drop the building on whoever was inside. And our rationale for doing that was there were no civilians in those buildings, that no one's house is worth the life of a Marine. And I'll say as an officer, there's no universe where I'm going to go sit in front of the mother or father of one of my dead Marines and say, well, the reason your son is dead was because we thought the house was more important. And I have complete and total peace with that decision. And in some cases, not in my battalion's case, but for instance, the battalion across the street from ours, which was 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, actually the battalion commander, when they were told to go house to house to house, said, I'm not going to do that. I'm actually just going to level my entire quadrant. And he did. And that was controversial. So, people can disagree with that decision. But that city was pretty much leveled over the course of the battle. And that's what war is. Now, if you want to know my personal opinions on the Iraq War, I think the Iraq War was an ill-advised war, a war of choice, not one that was in the best interest of the United States. I think one of the great crimes of the Iraq War actually wasn't the WMD. I remember what it was like to be here in 2002, 2003 in the lead up to the war, especially with what happened in the Persian Gulf War before, where Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction, and he was trying to convince the world that he had weapons of mass destruction. I think sometimes we're a little bit too hard on the Bush administration with regards to the WMD. I think what we should be very hard on the Bush administration on, and what was inexcusable, was the fact that after the invasion, there was no plan for what happens if there's an insurgency. It seemed incredibly obvious there would be an insurgency, or at least worth planning for. And the fact that there wasn't, I think, led to a lot of situations like what happened in Fallujah, like jihadists flooding into Iraq. So, I think that was regrettable. But in terms of the particulars of Fallujah, and once sort of the genie had been let out of the bottle, in the second battle and even the first, we took, the first battle was called off because of civilian casualties. In the second battle, I fought there for a month and I think I saw 2 civilians. And the second we saw them, they were both, pulled away and sent up through our lines. So, those are my observations.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I just wanted, I'm an Iraq War veteran too. I think sometimes it's good to take a perspective, years later and look back and see, what the cost of war was on both sides.
No, absolutely, Kim. And and this is something I've explored, in my writing. A lot of my writing gets into, the perspective of others. When my first novel, Green on Blue, is all written from the perspective of an Afghan. And I think that's critically important. Not only important for us to do as veterans, but something I really wish our country did more of. Particularly in light of how the Afghan withdrawal has gone and, what's happening right now with the imminent deportation of many of the Afghans or Afghan allies who we got out, which is, from my perspective, is a black mark on our country's honor.
I just want to echo, I'm going to send it right, but I just want to punctuate so that our audience knows that Elliot's first book, I believe it's his first book, his first novel, Green on Blue, is written in the perspective of an Afghan, which is something you just said, but I just want to emphasize how unusual that is for a Marine who fought in Afghanistan to write his first novel and have it be in the voice of an Afghan young man, a child. It is really extraordinary. I think it speaks to what Kim said of the importance of kind of like stepping back and seeing things from another perspective. I'm going to throw it to Daria.
Well, yeah, no, that's great, Todd, because I was just gonna, that was next on my list because I wanted to ask about, because it really marks your transition as a writer. That was your debut novel, but still, given, all your experiences, it's not a natural assumption that, someone who had all these experiences could then go and sort of like take the opposite perspective. And I'm wondering, and I just want to say to everyone that Elliott's book has been really praised for how well he got the tone and the feel of their two brothers in Afghanistan. And so I was wondering if you could just talk us through that process. I mean, aside from it being your first book, which was, is always challenging, just to kind of get into that headspace. How did you do that?
Well, I think, the first thing is one of the reasons I write is, I mean, so I think it comes like with, any, I think all of us have probably had the experience, right? Whether it's, a book we've read or a movie we've seen, or maybe you go to a museum and you see like an incredible work of art and, you feel something, maybe you cry at the end of the movie or you stay up late watching the book or you feel overwhelmed by that piece of art. And that is that this amazing sort of ability we have, as humans to, when we create something, like I'm feeling something when I'm writing a book. If like I'm writing and things are going well, I'm feeling something. And if you as a reader can feel any part of what I feel, what's occurred is like this type of emotional transference. Like I've transferred some of my emotion to you. So how that relates to sort of, writing someone that's out of your experience is these characters actually aren't out of my experience. Like they're two brothers. Like I have a brother and I have a very specific relationship with my brother that I can draw from to try to create that character. The reality is when I fought particularly in Afghanistan, you asked me about what happened in Shawan. There were only about 15 Americans on that mission. There were 200 Afghans on that mission in that ambush. So who are my war buddies? Yeah, they're Americans, but they're also all these Afghans. And we did all the things together that, the men at war always do. We hung out together, we joked together, we buried our dead buddies together. And a lot of those dead buddies were Afghans. So writing from the perspective of one of my Afghan comrades doesn't become that difficult because I have a way in where I'm like, I understand that you and I, yes, you're Afghan, but there are all these ways that we are similar. And I'm going to choose to make the assertion of how we are similar instead of fixating on the way that we're different. And from that, try to tell the story or what I feel about our similarities can be transferred to someone, some reader somewhere who might have nothing to do with this. So at times in my work, people have asked me like, who's your ideal reader? Mm-hmm. And sometimes people will assume that my answer might be like, oh, well, it's in, other veterans or people who were there. And that's actually in some ways not I love that other veterans read these books, of course, and it means a lot to me that they do. But what sort of gives me the most satisfaction where I'll get, someone might come up to me or send me a note who has nothing to do with this world. But I read your book X, Y, and Z, and wow, it really, it opened my eyes to something I'd never seen. And to me, that's the most gratifying because it shows how that type of storytelling can reach the furthest to bring someone in. And to me, war, and to what we were just talking about before, war is such a fundamentally destructive act. And it's very gratifying for me in the second chapter of my life to be engaged in things that are fundamentally not destructive, but creative. And to me, it feels like a very optimistic action as well. So I guess these books are kind of the optimist in me always.
Yeah, and I'd say they're also very constructive because when you're reaching people and connecting people with the other, who they
Yes.
might have othered, then you're actually doing more than just telling your story. I mean, it's really transcending that a bit. And so what I guess what I wanted to ask you next was, at one point, I think you were involved and actually wrote a book about, Afghanistan and the fall of Afghanistan and what went wrong. And what was your experience when with the fall of Kabul and the whole? We had done previously, we've done, and in the magazine, we've had articles and done programs with people who've been involved in like digital Dunkirk and helping people out. How did you experience that?
Sure. Well, so that book was called The Fifth Act: America's End in Afghanistan. Um, and the title of the book comes from, so I do a lot of work as a journalist. And in early August, as everything was coming apart in 2021, a friend of mine who was an editor sent me a note and said, "Hey, listen, very quickly, we're putting together a roundup of what's going on in Afghanistan right now, because frankly, no one's been paying attention for years. So, Elliot, would you mind, could you give me, it's going to be like you and this person, this person, this person. Could you just give me what's gone on in Afghanistan in the last 20 years? I can give you like 400 words." I was like,
400.
400 words for 20 years of war in Afghanistan. I was like, huh. And the idea that came to that moment, I was like, well, and I said, well, geez, like that's not a lot. She said, I know, but people don't understand what's going on. All they know is this is a tragedy. And that word tragedy stuck with me, because tragedies typically, if you look at plays and drama and dramatic constructions, tragedies are actually typically told in 5 acts. And so I was like, well, and this is my little 400-word piece wound up being it, that the first act was Bush, the second act would be Obama, the third act was Trump, the fourth act was Biden, and the fifth act would be the Taliban. So the reason it's called the fifth act is the book structure kind of follows that. So a couple of weeks later, my publisher sent me a note. My book agent said, "Hey, Ellie, we think it'd be great. Maybe you could do, because I've been writing on the subject, we could do a very quick book in the fall that would be sort of what's gone on in Afghanistan." I said, "That sounds great." We agreed to do the book quickly. It'd be, sort of short, like, 120, 30 pages. And then I went on holiday with my family for a very long planned summer vacation in Italy, of all places, with all of our kids. And then everything started imploding. I'm sure everyone on this call was familiar with what started happening in Afghanistan. And for me, the line I kept coming up with was, if there are any film buffs here, it was the line in the last Godfather movie when Michael Corleone says, "Just when I think I'm out, they pull me back in." But all joking aside, all the Afghans I knew, many of whom had come to the US at that point, but they still had family in Afghanistan, were asking for help, and everything was collapsing on the airport. And so I, like many others, got involved in these digital Dunkirk efforts, not only as a Marine and CIA agency veteran, but also as a journalist, because many of my colleagues as journalists had their fixers and others were trying to get out. And underpinning that entire effort, for me, it was this idea that's fundamental not only to the U.S. military, but is really an idea that's as old as war, which is we don't leave our people behind.
Right.
I mean, it's a very old idea. If you look at stories we tell about war, really the very first 2 stories in human tradition are the Iliad and the Odyssey. And some people might forget the way the Iliad ends. The movie ends with the sacking of Troy, but the way the book actually ends is Achilles has killed Hector, the son of King Priam, the king of the Trojans, and he's dragged Hector's body back to his camp. And he's sitting there with Hector's body outside of his tent, and King Priam sneaks into Achilles' tent and says, "Please give me my boy's body back so I can give him a burial." And Achilles does, because he honors this idea that we don't leave our people behind. So this is a very old idea. So I'm watching this, and it's underpinning all of these people's efforts. But and everyone working on this initiative knew that at the end of the day, there was going to come this moment where we're going to have to say, that's it, the last plane's leaving, you are all going to be left behind. And so the book, it tracks a series of cases that I was involved in, of trying to get individuals out. Some were successful and some were not successful, and sort of tracks those. It tracks from a policy standpoint, the arc of, these four presidents in the end game in Afghanistan. And then from just sort of a personal standpoint, it tracks that the ambush we mentioned, and a moment of that ambush where I felt like I didn't completely uphold the idea of what it means to leave somebody behind. And it was something I've sort of been, wrestling with for years, and I wanted to write about that because it kept coming up. That memory kept coming up again in those months at the end of the war.
Wow. So, I'm just curious, what is the sort of relationship between, because I know there were people left behind, there were allies, not everybody who was an ally, or working for the United States got out. Is there any effort? Is there anything that anybody can do or is doing now, or is it just like there's nothing you can do to help anybody?
Yeah, I mean, it's been pretty difficult. I mean, I think one of the difficulties is even if you get people out, they can't come to the U.S. necessarily. They have to go to other places. So, the efforts I've seen have been, pretty catch as catch can. I mean, you're talking about smuggling people out of a country. So, very difficult. And I think that's why there was such a sense of incredible urgency in the summer of 2021, because everybody understood that once this door shuts, it's going to be extremely difficult to open it up again. And I think, one area where there are many efforts is to not have people sent back who've come here.
Well, what is that? What's the state of that right now? Is that are people who have come, because we've done stories on Afghan families, on veterans who've helped families, brothers. We have a whole story on two brothers who were, one Army veteran helped get out, and they're running a business in Michigan, and they have families and children, and is there a sense among veterans about like how vulnerable they are given the changing tone of things?
Yeah, no, they're pretty vulnerable. I mean, most of the Afghans who came here came out on what's called a humanitarian parole, which got them 2 years in the United States, which has since expired. And because their status hasn't changed, now on a case-by-case basis, they have to negotiate their immigration status, whether or not they'll be able to get on track for a green card. And if they're not able to renegotiate their immigration status, they're either in the position of living here illegally and then being subject to deportation, or not. So it's a tenuous existence, and one, not befitting our comrades in arms from that war. So it's complex and kind of now falls into larger conversations that are going on in this country about immigration.
Wow.
Joe Griffiths, you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Todd, and everyone. Elliot, I want to thank you for.
Joe, we're having a really hard time hearing you for some reason.
I'm muted.
Yeah, no, you're unmuted, but it's the microphone.
How about now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Elliot, thank you for your bravery, your leadership, and your common sense leading men and women, Marines. I have two short questions, and I'm sure quite a lot of your men are home now reading your book on account of just the leadership that you gave. It's a pretty remarkable story, and you can feel it and see it in your face of what men thought of you. One is, did you have a nickname? What did your soldiers call you over there?
Sure. Just make sure. I think that the question was, did I have a nickname? My nickname when I was in the Marine Infantry was Sir, because that's the culture of the Marine Infantry. But it won't surprise you that when I got to the Marine Raiders, which is a much more of a kind of swashbuckling commando culture, which is also a very nicknamey culture. My nickname was Cracker, because my first team sergeant, who was a force reconnaissance veteran, later legendary Marine Raider, a guy from South Boston named Willie, Gunnery Sergeant Willie Bare Knuckles Parent, because he had a reputation for liking to fight. When I first checked into the unit, he took me skeet shooting with him and a couple senior Marine Raider NCOs, kind of, real legends. And I showed up to go skeet shooting in a pair of loafers with Argyle socks, and they said I looked like a cracker. So that was it. My nickname became Cracker for all time.
my other question was probably the worst kind of combat is door to door, going in buildings. You never know what to expect. It can be very scary, very terrifying. I remember a lot during the early parts of the war. Soldiers were writing home, asking their families to send them silly string so they could maybe spray it on doorways to see if there were tripwires or bombs. Did you ever use that?
Sure.
Could you repeat that, Elliot? Because what we're
Yeah.
having a tough time hearing.
Why did the
Sure.
families have to send silly string and the government didn't provide that?
Yeah, I heard that. So the question was about silly string and tripwires and whether or not we ever sprayed silly string on doors for tripwires. That wasn't a tactic we used. But I was certainly, though, in Iraq during the days where IEDs were becoming prolific and we didn't necessarily have the advanced up armored vehicles that showed up later. So I remember my very first patrol in Iraq where I was replacing the outgoing battalion I was with. We sat in the center line seating of the Humvee, and all of the Marines were stacking cases of bottled water and MREs in front of them. And I asked them what they were doing, and they said, "Well, that's for the IED, so it hits the water and the MREs before it hits us." So over the course of time I was in Iraq, I saw a lot of better equipment come in. It wasn't quite top notch, but eventually it got to us. But the silly string wasn't something I saw, but I think you'll always see, in any combat zone, Marines and soldiers in any war kind of having to, improvise and adapt as the enemy deploys new tactics, for sure.
Are there other questions, Todd?
Let's
that you
see.
can
No,
see?
I'm looking for pictures of silly string on silly string on tripwires because I've never heard of that, Joe.
Yeah.
I saw Terry nod her
Terry
head.
has a question.
Terry. I saw her nod her head about the silly string.
Yeah, I don't know if the silly string was really a thing or just a myth. But anyways, my question is, so after Afghanistan and the Marines, did you go back there as a CIA agent?
Good question.
So I was, when I finished my time in the Marine Raiders, was recruited to go over to the agency's special operations unit as what's called a paramilitary officer. And then I went back to Afghanistan, and the work I did there was very similar to the work I'd done with Marines. It was largely advising Afghan counterterrorism units that worked for the U.S. government and also doing intelligence work, but kind of all over Afghanistan.
Oh, okay. Thanks. And thank you for what
Thank you,
you've
Terry.
done. Yeah.
You too.
Oh.
I want to, before the program ends, I just want to have a chance to ask Elliot again about his new book, Sheepdogs, because I really can't recommend it enough. It's a great read. It is funny. It is dark, and it's a good thriller. And so I just wanted to kind of get a sense of how did you come up with these characters? And I just want to note also that you do have some good names in there. There's some interesting jargon too. How did you come up with their names and the characters? Are they based on, well, anyone you knew or a little bit on yourself? One of them, I guess.
Sure. Well, any of these characters. So, as I mentioned, it's about these two guys who become international repo men. One is a Marine, and he was a Marine raider and a CIA paramilitary officer, much like me. And his nickname is the Squirrel, because like a squirrel, he can kind of get you anything, but he spells it Skwrl. Why? Well, if there are any Marines on this call, you might know that we're not always the best at spelling. So everyone started spelling his name Skwrl. So he's Squirrel. And the Afghan, he was a pilot. And you can imagine he was basically like the closest thing Afghanistan ever had to Maverick, just their greatest pilot. And everybody called him, his name is Aziz Iqbal, but everybody called him the Big Cheese Aziz. So when the book opens, your two protagonists are Squirrel and Cheese, and they are these repo men. And you kind of enter this world where, yes, the people from their lives all have these kind of, not all, but many of them have sort of funny nicknames from their times in special operations. And so they, the book opens, they hijack this jet from an airfield in Uganda, and a lot of hijinks ensue. And the reason they're hijacking this jet is because they're working for a mysterious figure named Sheepdog, and he runs something called the Network. Kind of think like Charlie from Charlie's Angels, and Sheepdog is the guy who gives them their missions. But one of the mysteries of the book too is who is Sheepdog and what is Sheepdog and why is he giving them each of these missions? So the book is planned also to be a series of books. So where each book is kind of a new caper, a new heist, and the mystery of who and what Sheepdog is slowly revealed.
And I guess we can mention, and I guess this is big congratulations that it's being turned into a television series.
Yes, yes. So we're working on putting it together as a TV series. So that's been a lot of fun.
Well, that's exciting. Like maybe by 2007 or
27?
2027. Yeah.
I hope so. I'm working at it.
Oh, that'd be so cool. And Elliot, you're too young to know who Charlie's Angels is.
Yes.
Can I jump in also
Yeah.
before we end? I would love Elliot to talk about the Global War on Terror Memorial that is being developed in Washington, D.C.
Yes. I'm honored to be just part of this effort, which is the Global War on Terrorism Memorial. In my capacity there, I am the co-chair of the Design Advisory Committee. And so we've been working to get feedback from across the country and also going out to like key stakeholders. Over 24 individuals who've all chimed in on the design of the memorial. And we're still in the process of developing that design. But I think what's really exciting news is that after authorizing the memorial, it had to be authorized by Congress. We've settled on a site. If you go to the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation's website, you can see the exact site of the memorial. But I'll just tell you that if you go to the National Mall, and let's say you're standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, you might know that if you look off to your right, there's the Korean War Memorial, and off to your left is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Right between the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and the Lincoln Monument will be the Global War on Terrorism Memorial. So it's a really fantastic, yeah, there you go, right in the chat if you want to look. It's a really great parcel of land. The CEO of the War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation, Rod Rodriguez, a former Special Forces soldier, from 7th Special Forces Group, La Familia. For any of those of you who know, I spent some time with 7th Special Forces Group. Has done a fantastic job shepherding this process through the powers that be in Washington, D.C. So I myself am very much looking forward to not only us breaking ground on the memorial, but to the day that it is unveiled.
The day that it's dedicated.
Is there a time frame?
I cannot say there's a time frame the day will be completed, but everyone is moving with all urgency. And right now, preliminary designs sort of this winter are moving through the various committees in government in DC that they need to get to kind of hit the next level. So it probably won't surprise you. It is a somewhat slow and bureaucratic process. And the team that's working on this is moving as quickly as they can. And it's a great group of folks.
Great.
Oh, I think building a memorial is probably 100 times harder than a person leaving Earth's orbit. I mean, it takes so long. I can't believe anybody would dedicate themselves to it because it's so thankless. It's so difficult, so much red tape, takes so long. So, Elliot, thank you for doing that. Nancy Lee, how are you?
I'm doing well, and I'm loving the storytelling that I'm hearing tonight. And I just really appreciate, as a non-military person, but one who honors and loves veterans, I appreciate the leadership that I'm hearing and the wisdom. It's just so amazing. So, Elliot, as you look back on your career for America as an American hero, do you have any regrets at all?
Oh, thank you. First of all, thanks for those very kind comments. I'm not big on regrets. So I don't know that I have any regrets per se. That doesn't mean I don't have sadness and I don't have, I don't have many moments I look back on and wish they could have gone a different way.
Yeah.
But I don't spend time beating myself up about them. Uh,
Yes.
and I think that's the healthiest way to be. I will say that I have a lot of people I miss. Um,
Mhm.
and I don't know if that's regret, but I definitely have a lot of people I miss. Um, and I give anything to see them again.
Yes, of course.
Boys,
Thank you.
wonderful question, Nancy. And a
Thank
really tough one. Thank you for that. Daria.
Yeah, I just wanted to I have another question about the memorial because I was interested, and maybe you weren't part of this, but just in terms of how did they arrive at the idea of doing a global war on terror memorial and sort of merging it all as opposed to doing
Yeah.
one for Iraq and one for Afghanistan because they're usually very geographically specific.
Well, thanks,
And
Dory.
then,
Actually, yeah, go,
oh,
sorry, second part. Yeah.
oh no, the second part was I'd also heard that it's the memorial itself is the philosophy behind it is that it's to be very inclusive of, you know, to include the Afghan allies, et cetera. I don't know.
So the first part of the question is the Global War on Terrorism Memorial, I will concede, is a mouthful. But by statute, that's the war. So if you remember, we had
Okay.
Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom. Um, just like, in World War II, there were various Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. So by statute, it has to be to the war that we fought. And the war we fought was the global war on terrorism. That's how the
Oh, that's
President
so
Bush set it
interesting.
up. So that's what the memorial is, the Global War on Terrorism Memorial. In terms of it being inclusive, it's an American memorial. I mean, this is for America. So this isn't
Yeah.
for, I mean, as much as, you know, I believe in honoring our allies. This is not a memorial to our Iraqi partners or Afghan partners. This is to American service members. The idea of it being inclusive, and I even inclusive is sort of a word that for whatever reason, it's sort of gotten a bad rap, or it's become a politicized word.
Yes.
That's not the way that word is meant. The way that word is meant is that there shouldn't be anyone who was touched by this war who walks up to the memorial and says, "I don't see any of myself here." There's none of my experience reflected in this. Like I would argue the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, one of the reasons that memorial is so powerful because it is a very inclusive memorial. And the way it achieves that inclusivity is that when you walk to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and you stare at a name, what stares back at you is your reflection in the polished black granite. So you see yourself in that memorial no matter what. So in the design process, one of the ideas is that, we want people to see themselves. Like, everything obviously from a service member who lost a good friend. I mean, that's a really obvious one. But, what like a service member, or they're the child of a service member who maybe both parents came home, but that child knew that, his mother and father spent 15 years apart during the war, came back, and after 3 years, their marriage fell apart and his life was very difficult. And he traces that to the war. So it's something that, yes, it's fundamentally is going to be about our war dead. But it's also about the cost of war. And so, that doesn't mean that you're going to have a section that identifies that, but how do you sort of convey that in a design? And that's sort of been the challenge is wanting it to be as inclusive as possible. Or, to an amputee, how do they see themselves in this memorial? So that it touches the most people. So that's been, for those of us who've worked on it, that's sort of been one of our North Stars is particularly for a war that sometimes felt forgotten, to have as many people invited into this memorial to see something of themselves and their country in the memorial as well.
Yeah,
So
I think that's really interesting because it also, I mean, somehow I would think, you'd have to incorporate the idea that this was also such a long war.
absolutely, it was a war that I would say was interesting because it was not generationally defining in the way that the Vietnam War or World War II wars. If you're from my generation, I don't think you would say that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan defined the generation, but it is a war that was generationally long. So for those of us who fought it, it was an entire generation worth of time that fought this war. So it's also a forever war, in that service members still are settled. Not like 10 or 15 years ago, but can still be killed fighting in the war on terrorism. So how do you memorialize a war that will never end? And it's a question, if, seeing as war is as action, we never stop engaging as human beings, in some ways it's almost a memorial to war itself, because war never seems to end.
No, that's absolutely true. I was just thinking you could have generations in the same family.
Yeah.
And this memorial could speak to, parents and children.
And you have, and Rod Rodriguez, the gentleman I mentioned, who's the CEO of the foundation and has been sort of had his shoulder against the grindstone the hardest in this. He served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and his son served in Afghanistan in the same unit, the 82nd Airborne Division, as him.
Wow.
So there's a lot of diversity of experiences in the core group that's working on this memorial. To Gold Star parents, Gold Star spouses. So we're really trying to bring in as many people as we can to make sure that there isn't any one who's overlooked.
So I guess we've reached the end of our program, and I just want to say thank you so much, Elliot. You've really just given us so much to think about, and just to listen to your experiences and the books you've given us. I even read Halcyon, which isn't even
Thank you.
about because I read everything. But anyway, so we just want to thank you so much. I'm sure everyone really appreciated it. And I'm just going to say I'm going to contact Tricia so I can get your email so I can fill you in on LA to see if you're interested.
Please, thank you so much.
Yes. And I do hope our paths cross again. Thank you, Elliot Ackerman, for spending so much time with us and, allowing us to kind of learn from you tonight and hear new perspectives. That's for sure. And thank you, Daria, again, for bringing Elliot to us into this program. We do have Steve Giordano. He did ask in the chat, how do we get a signed copy of a book? What's the best way for Steve and the rest of us who want a signed copy, Elliot, to get one?
Well, if you come to any of my book events, which are listed at penguinrandomhouse.com, you can get one that way. That's probably the easiest and quickest way.
Okay, Steve. So next time Elliot's in Kane, Pennsylvania, you'll pick
Yes.
up. That's good. All right. Hey, thank you so much. Good night, everyone.